This conference will now be recorded.
Henry or Sam, who's going to go first?
Do you want to do the shorter presentation first or the longer?
Sam, I think you're up first. You ready?
All right, I'll go first.
All right, Sam. So everybody, Sam is a well-known in the house, and he's an awesome guy, and he knows a lot about a lot of stuff. So looking forward for his talk, and take it away, Sam.
All right.
Thank you, Sam.
Please put this slides because people are going to ask about the slides in the chat channel. So I'm sharing. Okay, show. You see the presentation now? Yep. Looks like GoToMeeting picked up on it. All right, I'm Samuel Greenfeld. I'm been a CISSP certified for about 10 years. Recently went for the software variant, specialized in software quality assurance, especially on the security side. Black Hat scholarship recipient, went there last year as a result. Also have done many of the conference recordings for HackMiami that you see on the YouTube, as well as recorded the first year of Pacific Hackers Conference. And the reason I'm giving this talk is I'm a licensed amateur radio operator for the past 30 years. Let's see, make sure I'm on the right screen with the cursor. So the agenda. What is amateur radio? What can you do? What you cannot do? Operating practice, how to get your license, and the conclusion, I guess. I was hoping to do this in person so we could show off toys. Unfortunately, we're not at the library, so we cannot really go off into showing toys today. So the top service, what is amateur radio? Technically, it's defined radio communication service for the purpose of self-training, intercommunication and carried out by amateurs, that is, duly authorized persons interested in radio technique solely with a personal aim without a pecuniary or really a financial interest. It's regulated by the Federal Communications Commission of the United States, and I would say it's not really a single hobby, it's a range of possibilities. That said, the reason I'm saying it's a lot like using a car. I mean, you can just drive around the car casually to where you need to go. You may want to build a car from scratch. You can do that with amateur radio. You may want to pimp out your car and make it all fancy, or you may want to try to race it or something. And those are all sorts of things you can do with amateur radio as well. So again, you can do conversation locally around states, the world. It's a concept of directed nets where one operator controls the flow of traffic and who should talk when. These are typically done to exchange message traffic. We also use it to manage an event such as a marathon or an incident such as a hurricane. It's a concept of de-expeditions where people are actually traveling internationally to locations to run amateur radio. Usually they choose a nice looking location which is rarely may not have very many amateur radio operators to be at. You can contest. There are people who try to work all states or continents, work 50, 100 countries, who can make most contacts in a certain amount of time. Maybe bonus multipliers for using certain techniques and stuff. Field day is your general kind of a practice emergency whatever run, which is done every year, which really just crowds the bands. It's your fourth weekend in June, presuming it still happens. There's lots of local events. You might be able to see someone doing stuff. Alternatively, there's Winter Field Day, which is done in January, but it's not done by the same organization. And the concept of sending around QSL or response cards saying, little postcards saying, I talked to this person, or nowadays modern equipment is the logbook of the world, which is an online system. And you can experiment with amateur radio, different operating modes, different designs, internet links, although that's pretty common nowadays, so not really as experimental. You may want to try how far can you go in low powers, are very commonly done. Satellites or Earth bouncing is also done a bit. And I just gave an example of FT8 is weak signal communications. Here they're repurposing a protocol used actually to talk to deep space probes, and it's basically a very automated communication that can be done to transfer things back and forth. Volunteer emergency services are also done. You may just do visit volunteer for like a marathon or rock or run or other event. You have the concept areas, which is amateur radio emergency service. It's more of a private sector things. More officially, you have RACES, which is Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, which is explicitly defined in the rules that define amateur radio. In practice, these are usually the same groups. Often have other groups out there. You have Hurricane Watch Group, Saturn, there's the Salvation Army, Civil Air Patrol, Military Amateur Radio Service. Contribute traffics might be needs, maybe health and welfare. There's maybe a lot of side traffic, which may just be people trying to confirm that people are still alive, or people passing along messages confirming someone is still alive. One thing I will note, especially since September 11th, these groups often require explicit training, registration, background checks, all done before the emergency actually happens. If you're doing anything that involves the government, chances are you're going to need to take FEMA's Incident Command Service ICS courses, like 100, 200, and 700. This is a federal requirement. This is not something can easily be bypassed. Some groups also like for amateur radio 800. ARL likes ARL level 1 for areas groups, and if you're working with the Red Cross or something, they may also want you to have their certifications as well. So now we've gone through what's allowed, what's not allowed, generally having a financial interest in the conversation, public broadcast, music, foul language, commercial, legal usage, encryption. You can't encrypt things on amateur radio, sadly. You can do like a message hash though. Using more than the minimum power required generally also is frowned upon. That said, these are generally speaking, there are kinds of exclusions, like if, for example, you had an agreement with NASA to rebroadcast the audio from a space station, and they happen to play music to wake up the astronauts, well, that's okay. Or if you scheduled a time to talk to the space station with your class, and you were the teacher, and you were being paid to be their teacher, that's also okay too. And there's, as I said, there's some gray areas with this. One talk is often how much of the process of can you order of a pizza over amateur radio, and the interpretations of that actually have varied a bit over time. Here's just a picture of some of my stuff I just put together. The Kenwood little radio in the middle here. Let's see, just turn on a little pointer. This little radio here is 20 years old. It still works. It's just an AM/FM mobile rig. I just decided to show mobile rigs here because I know I've seen a lot of you carrying around bell phones, so these are a bit more powerful. That's just an FM radio, dual band. Typically dual band, we mean 2 meter for 40 rig. Up on top here, we have an ancient, also 20 years old, roughly speaking, packet radio, so it extends data about 1200 baud. And down below here, I have a modern radio, which is the Siezu thing here. That comes with that one has USB, that is a built-in sound card, that is upgradable firmware, that has all your modern fixings. So radio like that nowadays, it also does HF, VHF, so it covers a lot more bands. It can do a lot more AM, FM, digital modes, a lot more on its own. A radio like that, if you got it pre-made, that one's about $1,200. The modern equivalent to something like this probably is $300, $400 for the mobile rig. And that one probably nowadays would include Bluetooth. It would include the digital radio that's sitting on top of it. It could include GPS and a whole bunch of other things. So radios have evolved in general. So getting into operating practice, because I know we don't have so much time. There are currently 3 classes of licenses you can get for amateur radio. You start out as the technician, go up to the general, and now you have the amateur extra or extra class. Licensing is cumulative. You have to pass the lower exams to get the higher license. Also some discontinued license classes, but there's still people licensed under them, such as the novice, the technician plus, and the advanced class. These at all points had their own theory exams, but the main difference you could say is they required various different levels of Morse code knowledge than the current ones did. However, since the early 2000s, Morse code is no longer required. One thing I will note, because some people are paranoid here, is license records are public information. They no longer include information like your date of birth, but the basic record that you have an amateur radio license and your address will be public along with your call sign. That said, you do not need a license to receive amateur radio. This is primarily a license to transmit. Technically, the license historically would be also argued to be a license to be the control operator of an amateur radio station, as well as a license to have an amateur radio station, but that's almost a technical distinction. Here's the little bit of math. This is actually the only math I want to put in here, is that you have the concept of a wavelength is equal to the speed of light divided by the frequency. So basically, well, this given as an example here, why is the amateur radio band here between 144 and 148, roughly 150 megahertz, known as 2 meters? It's because if you divide 300 by 150, you get 2. And the reason that matters was when you're creating an antenna, they're often cut to fractions or multiples of the base wavelength. And if necessary, I mean, I can paste a link to this. Here's just a band chart. And I just pointed out, let's just point around the laser. So here are various amateur radio bands. You can see they break it down by what license class can do what, where in terms of frequency. This reason I'm also kind of mentioning this is you can see that there are a lot of bands. They vary in frequency. The bandwidth, they said, again, 3 meters in frequency, and you can see the naming. But notice how big some of these bands are. And they're not very big if you think about it, because if you look historically, I want to just compare it to Wi-Fi for a second here, because if you know your 2 gigahertz Wi-Fi bands, you have 3 independent 20 megahertz channels. Most of these bands here are not 20 megahertz wide at all. I mean, 2 meters is only 4 megahertz wide. You go down to 30 meters, that's like 0.05 megahertz wide. So we're talking a lot less bandwidth than you have with your Wi-Fi, especially once you get to 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi. You got 2 meters. You got your 40 megahertz channels, which are now 80, and now with Wi-Fi 6, 160 megahertz channels. And while you can do that at higher frequencies, you don't necessarily have access to that at lower frequencies. And for most of the amateur radio bands which are in common use, you're all sharing much less bandwidth than your typical Wi-Fi connection. But that doesn't mean you can't do voice and stuff. It just means that the radios use a lot of more historical techniques for audio. For example, you have your base here, you got, what would you call it? Just borrowing from Wikipedia, this video, you have this baseband signal, which is basically you speaking. That gets shifted up in frequency to you talking over here. I mean, if you make an AM signal, historically you had a copy and had another copy over here just of you speaking, along with this carrier here, which if you were just doing CW, all you really need is this carrier, which is very little bandwidth. But if you're smart, what you can do is we only have to really transmit this data, so you don't need to transmit this large carrier, which means you can also increase the power of this and use, regardless of what you're using, very little bandwidth. Same, alternatively, you could just transmit this bottom piece here, and you still are getting your point across. And that's basically how it's done with the at least at the lower frequencies, is you just are very conservative of how you use bandwidth. It complicates the radios a bit, but it's much more efficient use of the bandwidth. So the high level, basically the International Telecommunication Union, which defines the world into 3 regions. Region 2 defines what the FCC can allocate. And the FCC then turns around and says, given an amateur radio license of a given class, this is where you can operate. At more granular levels, there are best practices, recommendations that organizations such as the ARL put out, but they are not necessarily where you required by law. Repeaters and beacons should be coordinated so there are organizations that'll try and coordinate what frequency is used by what for repeaters within the best practice regions for where a repeater should be located. If you are coordinated, you are actually you are considered more important than someone who did not get coordination should there be a problem. As I said, because lower frequency bands have less data, your allowed symbol rate varies by band. However, modern encoding is more efficient, but they have to update the rules. But still, you're not going to, at lower frequencies, you're not going to get Wi-Fi bandwidth in 50 megabits a second. It's just not theoretically possible. Some allocations are on a secondary basis. Amateur radio shares their frequencies and others. And they may, some allocations actually have been lost. Like you may have noticed there was a gap in a band on the previous slide. That was because UPS at one point thought about using that for tracking packages. Eventually it did not happen, but the band section was lost anyway. These bands also vary near country borders as well if you travel internationally. So if you go close to Canada, there may be frequencies which are used in Canada for different purposes. So if you get too close to the border, you can't use them for amateur radio. That said, we have the concept of call signs, just like you hear call signs for TVs, whatever, you have call signs for amateur radio operators, just like radio station and everything else. That said, amateur radio call signs all have a number in them. Typically, we refer to them in like a 1x2 format would be 1 letter, a number, then 2 more letters after it. Within Florida, you're going to all have a call sign which begins with 4. If you start out by getting your call sign down here, if you're in California, you're going to have your call signs always starting with 6. It used to be decades ago that if you traveled around the country and moved, you would have to change your call sign to match the new region. That is no longer the case. Said they vary by class. By default, they're issued sequentially. If the higher the class license you get, the shorter of call sign you qualify for. But they're no longer changed when you moved around the US or change your license class. That used to be automatic. Just gave some examples, like before BOG originally was a person. I actually worked under K2RF. Somehow K4FAU is at Florida Atlantic University, and they've had that since 1964. But a more recent development is if you don't like the call sign they gave you automatically, there are vanity call signs you can pay for, just like getting a vanity license plate. So you got W4 WDW is at Walt Disney World. If it ends in MOT, it's often a Motorola one. WX4NHE is the National Hurricane Center. And as an example here of an inheritance, W4BUG, the original person who held BUG, which is a club in Broward County, died. But because there's an inheritance preference, they were able to retain the call sign. It's also, as I said, the concept of club stall signs, which are very much a lot of the use of the vanity call signs. Often if it's an individual getting a vanity call sign, they just want something shorter. There used to be a concept of RACES call signs for those emergency groups, but they no longer exist. So RACES groups have tried to grab their old call signs back as club call signs. If it's a super short call sign, it's typically for an special event, and you have to use your call sign regularly during conversation. There are ID requirements. I'm not going to go too much into to stuff. But during this is HackMiami and possibly Pacific Hackers, we're going to get into the technical stuff in terms of the operating stuff. And I want to get into the stuff really mostly that you're not going to cover in the guides. Obviously, with power supplies, you need to have proper voltage connectors, whatever. As you have, obviously, you should also consider surge currents, because my big little radio typically wants a 30 amp power supply. But even if you turn the power down all the way on it, it may accidentally trip a smaller power supply because it needs a strong current to start transmitting, even at a lower power. My older radio doesn't have that issue. But getting back to this slide, you have Anderson power poles. Especially since September 11th, they've been looking to standardize how everyone connects, so you can just borrow someone else's power sources. So Anderson power poles are your very common power bus. So you have, I have a picture of a power supply with Anderson power poles. You have a picture of this rig runner thing, which has power poles. And the connectors for power poles are genderless. So you can take a cable, so the jack is the same as the plug. You can just plug right into each other. There are some various size of connectors for power poles, but it turns out that the 15, 25, and 30 amp connectors all share the same external power size. So they vary on the back as to what wires you connect to, but it gives you an easy way to create a power bus at 12 volts that everyone else can connect to. You may also have started seeing this kind of stuff, these kind of connectors on Pure and other 12 volt supplies on like Amazon and stuff. Antennas, this could be a talk in itself. Can be homemade, they can be cheap, expensive, mass produced, operating frequencies control their size, may require ground plane or something. Traps techniques may be in use band. They're going to vary, obviously, in the power you can stand. Like if I take this tiny little antenna here, they can stick on top of a car. It's going to take a lot less power and stuff than this big one here that I can just stick on a car. When you're putting an antenna on a car, consider wind load. One thing I will note, if you have a special antenna like this, if you're putting a car on top of antenna, like, be sure to consider extra functionality, like if you can fold it over, like this one can be folded over. Connectors, again, vary widely. SMAs and reverse SMAs you typically see on higher frequency devices that need less power. Dial fungs are a prime example of using reverse SMA, while the radio you see on the left there is using a regular SMA connector. Just means they swap which part is supposed to have the male and female parts. UHF connector is a historical popular connector used at HF and VHF frequencies. When we're talking HF, VHF, UHF, there are some general ranges for what frequencies are in those range, very high or ultra high or things like that, but there's some room to play. BNC connectors may be on stuff in the 1990s, but I haven't seen them that popular now. N is more microwave, and NMO is another type of antenna mount you may find on cars. Cables, again, cables obviously vary in size. You have that super tiny thing. Obviously, the fly here, which was so tiny, I don't know, we didn't want to know how much loss it has. But then you get thicker connectors, like I think an RJ8X cable in the middle there, then RJ8U was twice the thickness. So that thicker one has twice half the loss per foot than the one in the middle. You have to consider, when you're making a cable one, you have to consider how lossy they are at the frequency you want to operate them at. Also have an antenna over here made out of LMR 400, which is a super ultra lossy, non-lossy cable, which is about the thickness of that one, but even half the loss of that. So the other thing is cable quality varies widely. You need to be aware of that. So you can get a cheap Chinese cable or something, or maybe a expensive cable, but depending on where you get it and the quality of the cable, just because they call it RG8X or 8U, a lot of these historically had mil spec standards, but a lot of companies are not really making them to those standards anymore. So if you have a poorly soldered on connector or something, you may have an issue where your cable may be more lossy than it otherwise could be. It's also perfectly possible for you to go out and buy your own cable and then use that. Grounding and ground planes. Be sure to properly ground everything. Should only be a single path to grounding. You do not want ground loops. It's the same thing with wiring the electricity in your house. Do not want your transmitting to be hot. Some of these have metal cases. If there's a floating ground, you could have a risk of a RF burn or something if you touch the case of your radio while it was running. And since this is obviously Florida, if you're considering outdoor antenna installation, consider lightning protection. Vehicle installations, depending on your radio set, my big guy would not like a cigarette lighter or jack, because a cigarette jack it's only 10, 15 amps. So even if I turn them all the way down, just starting them, you might accidentally blow a fuse. So if you have a radio like that, you may need to consider using the fuse box, wiring a tap there, or doing a direct wire to the battery. Most cars in the US should be negative ground. It's possible that you positive ground, and you're gonna have to consider that if that happens. Newer cars mix aluminum and steel. Why is this important? Because if you touch two types of metals together, they start reacting with each other, and there's some risks of one destroying the other. It's like the anode inside of your water heater getting eaten slowly. So if you have a car that uses a mix of these, you may need to consider if you need to use dielectric reeds, fast fasteners, or things like that when hooking up the radio if you have to bypass the normal fuse box or other circuits. You also may not be able to put a magnetic mount easily on the aluminum surface. Also in newer cars, they often have a battery monitor on the negative terminal, especially if they have an insta-start system, so they turn off the motor at every start light. If you bypass that, you're going to be drawing current away from the battery, and the battery monitor is going to get very confused as to why the battery seems to be in poorer condition than it is, because it thinks it should know how much current is going through the battery, and there's some current going through the battery that it doesn't know about. If this happens, usually these are in the negative terminal. You can use them to ground to the chassis of the car if it's negative, or you otherwise have to do it. Again, always fuse your power lines. I've even seen a negative line fused, as confusing as that is. So you want to make sure that there's no risk of if something happens, you want to also fuse as close as possible, reasonably possible, to the battery, so you don't accidentally cause damage to the vehicle. If you want to do computer stuff, there's plenty of computer software for whatever you want to do. Many things are now controllable by USB or serial ports. Sound modems are the art of using the radios. Your computer is a radio. You may use an isolated audio interface to then get that into the radio without risking having a problem back. Just like you have TCIP was derived from X25. X25 is a routable protocol which amateur radio, and Linux incidentally has a kernel module for it. So Linux on its own can root AX25 just as natively as it knows TCP/IP or IPv6. There historically also is on an entire 8 subnet on the internet, which is just dedicated to amateur radio. That said, they realized that subnet in today's day and age was a bit big, and there was this sale of roughly a quarter of it to supposedly, if you believe Wikipedia, for Amazon for over $50 million. So if you wanted to know how much an IPv4 address is worth, it's worth a lot. The actual details of that sale, though, have been somewhat obscured, but that's what's believed to have happened. APRS is just logging positions, all sorts of web interfaces. You may just log your contacts. There's software to do that, and if you want to send messages, there's software to do that too. Concept that is covered in the course a bit, and it is a concept of standing wave ratio, which is a ratio of your forward to your reflected power. When you're transmitting, not all your, if you had a perfect meshing antenna, all your power would go into the antenna, which would be a 1-1 scenario, which is ideal. But in practice, you're not going to get that. There's always going to be some sort of reflected power because the antenna isn't perfectly tuned, or your cable isn't, or a connector in the middle has a tiny little reflection off of that. Your radios can tolerate this a bit. If your basic FM radio for higher frequencies isn't necessarily going to let you play with it, but at the lower frequencies, you can have an antenna tuner compensate for minor errors. Ideally, you don't want to exceed 2:1 or 3:1 on this radio ratio because you can damage the antenna. Here I have some examples of stuff of 2 SWR meters. You can also have a digital meter. One here just uses a single line. If I show you here, this one just uses a single line to measure SWR. Here's an example of a dual fancier meter. It's just on one meter, it's showing you the forward power, on the other meter, it's showing you the reflected power. And where they intersect on these two lines cross over here, you can see where your SWR lies. If you're testing, do not transmit into your antenna. You can test your transmitter using a dummy load, which basically is a big resistor. They do not have to be big, very big. I have a 300-watt dummy load. I'm just holding it in my hand here. But if you're looking for something which needs to handle a longer term, you need to transmit for an extended period of time or at higher wattage, you can get an oil-filled paint can, basically. These are the size of paint cans. And those are dummy loads that you can transmit at high power on for an extremely long period of time. RF exposure limits, by government regulations, you do have to limit the RF exposures caused by your station. That said, there are two sets of limits, those involved with operating, those with the public. It's up to operators to prove that they are in compliance. In general, this is probably the most calculating thing you could possibly do with your station. Fortunately, there are a variety of people who put calculators on the web, which can help you try and do this. There's also a lot of things that can come into consideration that'll help you, such as the fact that you don't have to worry about if you're below a certain power limit, at least at the moment. And there's also factors that come into play, such as you're not transmitting all the time. So most of the time you're receiving. And also, depending on what type of transmission you're making, you may also get a little reducing factor as well. But however, the FCC has looked to harmonize these regulations across all of their services. So there will be generic exemptions replacing the amateur radio specific ones. However, I cannot tell you what's going to happen with that because that's still going to happen for the next several months while they're working on it. If there's an emergency, I could say, is there any questions? Because no one said anything yet. But not, I can keep going. You're good. Emergency use. Anything goes if there's an emergency, but you have better to have a good reason for doing it. Realize amateur radio is unencrypted. This does not mean that you talk to the nice police dispatcher who asks you to politely get off their frequency. I have heard a story of that happening. But outside of an emergency situation, just someone casually transmitting something where they should not be. But the FCC may alternatively limit amateur radio operations as they see fit during an emergency. Third-party traffic. You can let an unlicensed person operate your station if you're supervising them. You're still ultimately responsible. You can relay a message on behalf of someone else that you received in the past, so long as it doesn't break any other rules. That said, if you're going internationally, you do have to have a third-party operating agreement to send traffic internationally. There's also an additional identification requirement. You have to identify at the end who you were talking to. This also gets a bit complicated with internet services because if you're triggering a transmitter remotely over the internet in another country, then that kind of falls into their third-party rules. And I've once watched somebody using a service called Echolink traced off of an international node because they thought they couldn't they weren't allowed to remotely do that internationally. It's hard to say without knowing the rules of the other country if that was actually the case. Alternatively, you can go internationally with amateur radio. There's I'd say three main agreements for amateur radio going internationally. Some of these agreements are automatic. Some require you to apply ahead of time. Be sure to take a copy of your license and the appropriate paperwork. FCC, for one of the agreements, FCC just gives you a 3-page printout in 3 languages that you take with you, copy your license, and you're good. You go up to Canada, you just bring your license and there's certain identifications and it works. But there's other cases where you have to formally apply. And the allowed frequencies will be those under the treaty and allowed in the visited country. One thing I will note is that some of these agreements were written back in the age of Morse code. So if you don't know Morse code and can't copy Morse code at set rate, if they haven't modified those agreements, you may actually be knocked down a class in terms of what you're allowed to do internationally. Harmonics images, I'm just bringing, basically your modern radio isn't a simple crystal radio that works for AM. So you have this concept of bringing down the frequency like you saw from a higher frequency to lower frequency, just like in your CPU may run at 3 gigahertz, but the rest of your PC may only run at 400 or 800 megahertz, because it's a lot easier to take those frequencies further than the 3 gigahertz used inside of your CPU. The downside to this is just an example I took from Wikipedia of a heterodyne receiver, super heterodyne receiver, which is a very common design. You can make multiple stages of this. If you get into the SDR talk next week, they just loft off where that demodulator is, and that's where your SDR starts hooking in. The problem with this is that when you have a local oscillator, you actually can receive 2 frequencies. One you're trying to receive, and then there's the intermediate, the one you're not trying to get. There's also, as I said, harmonics, are just multiples of your frequency. So when you're transmitting at like 20 megahertz, although you would never actually, as you say, there's 25 because that's more closer to amateur radio. You're also going to have multiples of that frequency. You're going to be technically transmitting at 50. You're going to be transmitting at 100, and also a half at 12.5 and stuff. But ideally, you want to keep those to a minimum. And your receivers also have those kinds of risks of sensitivities as well. And this comes into play. So when you look up a radio spec, they'll give you like image rejection and things like that to tell you how sensitive the receiver is and how much it can avoid getting confused if there's an additional signal nearby. This especially comes into play with Chinese radios. I know a lot of you guys have been picking up on those bow phones. I have one too. In general, amateur radio operators are able to modify other radios for use in their bands. And this is generally not allowed for other services. Bow phones and similar are in a gray area. There was one FCC cease and desist on against a bow phone importer. Cheap radios are not necessarily as good transmitters or selective receiving as expensive ones. Yes, you can. That said, they're putting a lot of downward pressure on the pricing and possibly the quality of the fancier radios as well. So it's hard to see where this is going. So because you can buy, as people pointed out, you can buy one valve, you could buy 2 or 3 valve phones for the price of a more expensive radio. And yes, that more expensive radio may have Bluetooth and GPS and other stuff built in, but it makes it a very hard sell when you can just get a radio that you can toss aside even if the manual isn't the best and stuff. Interference, amateur radio is greater than part 15 devices generally. Part 15 being those devices you have, which you buy, all those devices you get at home and say may not cause interference, but may not cause interference, but if they get interfered with, they have to accept it. That's pretty much all your home devices with computers and stuff in them. So if amateur radio is interfering, technically you're not causing anything illegal there, but you're going to very much upset your neighbors. Other services are greater than amateur radio. If you're interfering with aircraft or something, you're in trouble. In general, though, it's best to be nice. This does not mean you intentionally transmit at full power to try and blow someone else's stereo. I have heard of a case where someone actually did that and it worked, but I don't recommend doing that because you probably would get in a lot of trouble if someone actually found out. But when you have interference, ideally you want to try and eliminate it at the source with your like a low pass filter or high pass or band pass. If you're trying to get it, if you've seen like also a choke on a USB or a power cable or something, that may also, it's an attempt also to keep power from either getting into or out of the device you may have purchased where the system is having issues. Rules enforcement is primarily self-policing. One thing I will note, which is recent development, the official observer program you may read about is replaced with volunteer monitoring. If you get too bad, they'll just tell you politely, please fix this. But if not, they may refer to the FCC. The FCC in general doesn't really have the budget that they'd like to have now as much as they used to in terms of enforcement. But if you are interfering with something like a commercial radio station or something, or you do get to the level you annoy the FCC, they're going to make you pay for it. I've regularly read of fines, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. So, but ideally, you don't want to get to that point. But I think it's very rare for it to get to the point. I can think of one example in Broward County where someone is constantly interfering with things and jamming for the fun of it, where it probably will get to that point, but that's generally not the rule. That said, ham radio in your house. Here's an example of a lovely clause from a declaration for a condominium somewhere in Palm Beach County. No ham radios without permission of the board. This also comes from an interesting era in the 1990s where I think the HOA lawyers thought they were more powerful than the government. I've had a few people tell me a clause like this probably is not legally enforceable, but how much do you really want to try and prove that is always the case. Over-the-Air Reception Device Act is another law out there. Is a law, it's not an HOA rule, it's actually a law, which is what allows you to have a TV dish and antenna within the quote-unquote area of exclusive use of your house. It overrides some HOA and municipal restrictions for these. This does not mean I can think of another association who has a clause which attempts to say that all the little things in OTAR still requires you to go through their committee and have your satellite dish approved, even if it's fully inside your house, and then it has to still go through all their rules and their little beautification committees and stuff. I have also read an FCC opinion which line by line shut down one of those clauses. That said, OTAR does not cover amateur radio, so you cannot use that as a basis for having an antenna inside of your fully enclosed patio, even if it's not poking outside of your house. PRB1 is the closest thing to an amateur radio equivalent, but only applies to municipalities. Basically says a municipality can't deny you having a reasonably sized antenna stuff, but it does not override certain concerns. So we're still waiting for legislation to cover amateur radio and HOAs. Amateur Radio Parity Act is repeatedly proposed. It's yet to pass Congress. In general, it's probably don't ask, don't tell, but if you're causing problems, like someone's DSL modem starts going nuts every time you try and transmit, you may have to try and work with them. It's probably just best to be polite and proactive. You may have to find yourself buying little RF chokes and stuff to put on their stuff if you absolutely have to, but it's probably on you just in general, because they're not going to, the other person who's having interference isn't necessarily going to know what to do. Getting a license, who can get a license? In the US, anyone pretty much who's not an agent of a foreign government. That said, if you were convicted of a felony, there's a more recent requirement if you're doing anything with the FCC, where you have to provide an exhibit explaining why giving you a license is in the public interest, notwithstanding the conduct. There was a study I read about this. It does not look like the FCC is really denying anyone for the most part if they had a felony. provided they provided this exhibit. And that exhibit, though, is public information. Usually, though, some of them have been filed privately. There is no age limit on amateur radio. How old you have to be licensed. In my family, it was before cell phones. Amateur radio was the daddy caller to see how close daddy was to being home. And licenses are generally valid for 10 years. That said, you have to use some online systems to get your license. The FCC has a system called CORS, which currently has 2 versions online. One uses what's referred to as the FCC registration number as your username. There's a newer system out there which can handle multiple FCC registration numbers. You want to get your FCC registration number before testing. Why do I say that? It's because as part of the FRN registration process, you have to give the FCC your social security number and other information. That is not set public, but you will have to give it to them. Part of the stuff the FCC does with the application is a so-called red light review, where they make sure you don't owe them and possibly other divisions of the government any money. The ULS is this other system, which is what refers to as so basically you think of CORS as their equivalent of Active Directory or their SAML authentication provider, whether it's their authentication system. ULS is a separate system which focuses on licensing. That said, when you finally get your license, you do not want to download the public reference copy of your license. You just look your name up, search in the public record, and say, oh, I can download my reference copy of the license. That's not the one you want. You want to log into ULS, currently using your FRN password. I don't know if they support email password login for it, and download your electronic authorization to get the official copy of your license to post around your house or wherever you're carry with you while operating. This is the license is public, but if you put your phone number or your social security number, something in the CORS registration, that is not public information. If you had a business registration, you would have to worry about it. And you only need one FRN number, even though the newer system can support multiple. Study guides, there's lots of ways to study. If you get an ARL study guide, it's going to probably focus on the theory, then tell you to read the test questions at the end of each chapter. You can also get study guides which focus on the test questions with theory as commentary as you go through them. The W5YI group tends to use those. Question computers themselves are updated every 4 years, but they're fully public information. You can find all sorts of websites where you can play with the question pool. Some will require you to log in to see them, some won't. Some will just let you download the entire question pool and you can just read it yourself. And unless you're going for the fully high-class license, you don't have to worry about any upcoming expirations. Taking the exam, all known exams are in person. There's some possibilities. A group in Alaska looked into the feasibility if you could do this online, but as far as I know, no one has come up with the ability. Volunteer exam coordinator groups administer it. Decades ago, you had to go to the FCC to take the exam. That has not been the case for a very long time. These are often done monthly. Large events such as DEF CON have their own exam conventions, smaller events as well. What to bring: photo ID, FRN number, pencils, a calculator, probably non-programmable is best, photocopy of anything. I don't think a certificate of successful completions really are relevant because you can't really get one license with getting a previous. I doubt most examiners will let you take a higher level thing without taking the lower level one first. There's an exam fee that's often done. This is only the time you have to pay a third party to do anything with your license. I mentioned this because once you get your license, you'll say, congratulations, please join this group, please join this. Here's our catalog. Please buy from amateur radio equipment from us and 20 other things. But you also have groups periodically saying, hi, you need to renew your amateur radio license. You can pay us to do it for you. You don't have to do that. You don't have to go through the VECs for anything after this point. You can just do it with the FCC directly unless you really want to use a VEC too. Various national societies that promote amateur radio, US this Amateur Radio Relay League. They'll obviously send you something once you get your license, but membership is not required. There's also lots of local amateur radio groups I could refer you to. There's also like other national groups out there like TAPR, which originally stood for Tuscan Area Packet Radio, but now they're national and do a lot of other stuff. It's amateur radio growing. Unfortunately, my favorite site for looking this information up, what doesn't have stopped updating for some reason, but there's probably at this time probably around 800,000 amateur radio operators. Also, the average life of the license is more than the half-life of the license. So in terms of raw numbers, amateur radio is still growing. The licenses are not expiring as fast as they're being added. This does not necessarily mean that people are very active. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people are just got their license and are idle. I tend to be pretty idle myself. And if you look at an actual amateur radio club, a lot of them tend to be older than the HackMiami groups, just on average. In conclusion, it's amateur radio. I'm not quite sure. I was hoping maybe someone would have had questions or wanted to go into a topic. That's basically everything I had to say on the subject. And I guess, are there any questions or things?
If you want, I can hop in here just a couple of quick things. And mind you, I'm not licensed for a ham radio operator, but Claymore and I have actually been kind of studying a bit on this topic over the last year or so. We both purchased from Mike's Electronics, which is over by Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport. He's not open all the time, but he is still open, and you can get the ARRL ham radio license manual from there, which is really good. It's got a lot of great stuff in it. And one of the things I also purchased a little while back was there's a book called Pass Your Amateur Radio Technician Class the Easy Way. And what this guy basically did was he's been a licensed radio guy for a long time, and he did something that I ultimately did earlier. He basically downloaded all the questions, the entire pool set from ARRL's website, which anybody can do. And what I did was I went and basically deleted all the wrong answers. So if you look in the events on Slack, I've basically posted a PDF that I created that is the entire test pool of questions. But what I've done was I've eliminated all the wrong answers. So it makes the book a lot smaller, easier to go through, and should help you out as far as memorization. And granted, you still probably want to go through the full licensed book as far as like just to understand really what it is you're talking about. But for just purposes of passing the test, this PDF file that I've posted up there, it's a stupid easy way to actually get there. And like I said, that Easy Way by Craig Buck, K4IA, is also a very good book. It's a bathroom book, if you will. Anyways, that's it.
Yeah, to an extent, I'd say doing an exam like that is kind of, you should know the theory at least behind all the basic math questions and the theory stuff. But I can understand you wanting to memorize like the questions on like what is this frequency range that I'm allowed to use on this band if they're giving very similar examples. But I would say it's best to understand the theory and not just why a specific answer is correct.
Right, and that's why I said I also advocate getting the big red book, the ham radio license manual from ARRL, which will go a lot more in depth.
Yeah, you can get these books from a variety of sources. As far as COVID-19 and Mike's Electronics, Mike's is an example of a local store. We're very fortunate to have one in South Florida that's still around because a lot of those don't exist anymore. There's also a lot of national change if you had to get equipment, internet, that will ship it from elsewhere in the country if you have to get stuff. Mike's Electronics, though, for COVID-19, I think he's only open in the mornings and you have to call in advance and possibly see what he's doing. But he is still open.
That might be possible because the last time Claymore and I went there, it was actually like it was before the whole coronavirus thing. So
yes, he does have COVID-19 hours and restrictions, but you'd have to call him. I think you have to call him in advance.
Hey, Sam, I got a question for you. This is Phil. I'm actually going to be doing the SDR talk in a few weeks here. Do you have any recommendations for book not necessarily related to the test in particular, but more, as you were saying, the theory and fundamentals?
Unfortunately, I think a lot of the books tend to focus on the theory and fundamentals. If you have a license, a book, the RL, probably the book that's probably the most common one out there, though it's a very, very, very thick book, is if you wanted to go into all sorts of details of lots of things, is the ARL handbook, which they update yearly, which is just a whole book full of articles on how to do all sorts of crazy RF and other things.
Anybody who wants like manual stuff for that, I've got a crap ton of PDFs. Hit me up and I can definitely send them over to you. I got everything from antenna theory to radio theory. So
Excellent.
I got a question.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought Danielle was speaking. So I went and got my technician license kind of on a whim. So what's a good starting radio to get? I'm not eager to drop $1,200 or even, you know, $300-400.
So what are you trying to do? Are you just trying to talk locally?
I don't know, just good introduction radio, right? I mean, I got the license, I don't know what to do with it. So I just wanted to, I don't know, a good decent starter set, I guess.
I mean, well, you could start with like handhelds. Handhelds don't tend to be very expensive radios. If you have a local like repeater to talk to, you should also like possibly look into getting involved with your local amateur radio groups. Some of them, like there's a group in Palm Beach County, has its own shack sitting in a park, and that's possibly a good. You should look around and see what they recommend. I would say just. I don't know. It's a very open question. If you're just looking to casually talk to someone locally, then you just need a little handheld might be sufficient for your use. But if you're looking to talk internationally, then you're probably looking at, plus if you have room, putting a dipole outside of your house or something, which is just a big long line of wire. Then you might be looking, which that's very cheap to do. But then even used, you might be looking like for like maybe a $500 HF radio. The HF stuff is probably a lot more expensive than the FM radios because they do a lot more bands and stuff. And even older HF radios tend to hold a lot of their value for whatever reason. Primarily because the basic radio theory has not changed much in years, even if they don't have built-in fancy digital signal processors and things, waterfall diagrams and stuff that an SDR equipped radio can do.
Yeah, there are a lot of good SDRs out there that you can find on Amazon and on the web. There's a couple good backpack radios. I was trying to actually put the link into this GoMeet channel, but it's not letting me for some reason. But like for $200, you can get a pretty decent, powerful backpack radio with a 10-hour battery life.
I mean, you mentioned the Baofungs. Is getting one to play with a good idea or not? And if so, which one? They seem to have quite a few models at roughly the same price range.
I think the Baofungs are actually okay for a starter radio. Just don't admit that that's what you're actually talking on, because a lot of the amateur radio guys blast the Baofungs. Another good resource to look at also for those of you guys who actually are on Facebook, there's plenty of ham radio groups that actually can share a lot of information as well. I've done a lot with those guys.
Yes. It is possible to lock down a Baofeng so it just transmits on the amateur radio bands. I've done it, but that tends to be where something else with a Baofeng. Be sure to set the alarm mode to local, otherwise you may find yourself accidentally transmitting a siren all over the place.
All right, guys, any other questions for Sam, Will, or Claymore? Or Phil, actually. I think a couple people joined in on that. All right, next up, go ahead, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, one of the guys mentioned the book that eliminates all the wrong answers. I didn't quite catch that. If you can, maybe, I don't know, maybe put it in the chat or maybe repeat.
I did. It's under the events. It's called ham.pdf.
Are you in the Slack channel, Leo?
Yes.
Yes, the Slack channel.
Also on the Slack channel, Slack system for the %27 Slack, you don't call it the channel ham radio, but there's the channel radio frequencies.
Yeah, I'm a part of that one as well.
Radio talk.
All right.
So are you part of the Slack?
I'm sorry?
Are you in Slack with us?
No, I am not. I just I saw this event on my on the app, and then I just joined. You know.
If you would kindly give me if you want to be invited to the Slack channel, give me your address and I'll send it on to the admin. Cool?
Yeah, how can I send?
All right. You can direct message me in the GoToMeeting chat.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Or if you just want it directly from me, hit me up. It's will.net@gmail.com. I'll send it to you. It's not a big file. It's not even a full meg.
Okay. All right. Is your name William Net?
Yeah, that's me. will.net@gmail.com.
All right. Henry is up next. Rob, did you want to do any kind of introduction, or are we just going to turn it over to Henry?
No, I think Henry should go for it.
All right, Henry, you ready to go?
Yep, perfect.
All right. I am making you the presenter. Poof, you are the presenter. Mimikatz. All right, take it away.
Thanks. So we're going to talk about Mimikatz. Just a quick run through about what it is, its uses, and how it's been integrated into other tools. So you'll have a lot of flexibility. Now, in order to understand, we will have to briefly go through Active Directory authentication. I'll try to cover that part faster than the rest. So what is Mimikatz? It's an open source tool that allows to view and save authentication credentials. So you're in a workstation, you can use Mimikatz to dump the credentials. You can see clear text passwords, you can see password hashes, stuff like that. With that, you can just copy the credentials. You can, if you don't have the clear text password or plain text password, you're just, and you have a hash, you can actually just pass the hash of the password to authenticate. You can use Kerberos golden and silver tickets and pass those tickets. There's also a technique called pass the key or overpass the hash. We're gonna talk about that. But basically a bunch of different attacks open up once you use Mimikatz and obtain this information from the workstation. So it looks kind of like this. It does require admin rights. So basically you run the tool. You're gonna type privilege debug in order to escalate privileges, and then you'll be able to just dump the passwords. As you can see in the picture, you're gonna see that it says down here NTLM, that's the password hash, and the plain text password that will come from it. Now with that, you can do whatever you need with those credentials, either log in into a particular account, or like I said, if it's common to be in a corporate environment where you're gonna have Active Directory. So let's try to quickly cover Active Directory authentication, which basically just falls into two different categories, either NTLM and Kerberos. They're technically not mutually exclusive. You can find a domain controller that would allow you to authenticate through NTLM while it's actually using Kerberos with other devices. So it's not necessarily mutually exclusive, but normally you will see it in a way that it somewhat is. Like it basically just focuses on Kerberos, or it has a bunch of legacy stuff, so it's basically stuck with NTLM. The difference between them, one is basically a challenge response style of authentication. We're gonna see it in detail in a little bit, but it uses password hashes that are easier to crack. Whereas Kerberos uses tickets and it uses AES encryption unless it's using, again, some legacy system with DES. But if it's using AES, it's going to be harder to crack. So let's talk just a quick overview on NTLM and how it works. It's super easy. Basically, the user authenticates with an application server and says, hey, this is my user. The user will, the application server will reply with a challenge, which is also called a nonce. It's just a random value. And then this nonce gets encrypted with the password hash and is sent back as a response. Now the application server is going to grab that response, it's going to grab the nonce, it's going to talk with the domain controller and say, hey, this guy is trying to authenticate with me. This is the number that I gave him. This is his response. Because the domain controller also has the same password hash for that user, it will be able to also encrypt the nonce, compare it with the result that the user encrypted, and if it is the same, then the authentication is a success, and the user will be allowed to access whatever they were trying to access on that particular service or server. Now, for Kerberos, I try to simplify it. I'm not entirely sure if I actually managed to do that, but I'm going to try to go through it a little bit faster. This one, actually, an easy way to see it is that it works the other way around. Instead of asking the server, hey, I need to access something, and then that server communicating with the domain controller, in this case, you're authenticated directly with the domain controller. You're going to get a ticket granting ticket that basically allows you to come back with that and say, hey, now I want to use a particular resource. So in order to get that resource from the domain controller, you say, hey, remember that I already authenticated? Here's my ticket granting ticket. Now I need a service ticket to be able to go and talk with whatever service or server you're trying to access, whatever resource within the network you're trying to access, you'll have to follow those steps. You're going to see actually that pretty much encryption is at every single step of the process. So at first, you're encrypting a current timestamp. That's to avoid replay attacks with the hash derived from the username and password. You send that to the domain controller. The domain controller sends back a ticket granting ticket that it's encrypted with a password only known to the authentication server. Once you get that ticket, you can communicate back with the domain controller and start asking for service tickets, which in turn are encrypted, but with a different password that is known to both the domain controller and the application server that you're trying to access. Now, why is this important? Because if we go back here, remember that we talked about Kerberos golden and silver tickets? Okay, so now that we understand the concept of how all of this ticket works back and forth, basically a generic ticket from the domain controller, a particular service ticket for each service that you need to access. So now I'm going to talk about Mimikatz within other tools performing these different types of attacks. That is overpass the hash, golden tickets, silver tickets. But at the same time, I wanted to show you how you can do this with Mimikatz actually within other tools. So you can expand on what you can do within other engagement. You're going to have a bunch of different tools, such as the USB rubber ducky, which is basically it's mostly known for the physical social engineering that will allow you to get an initial foothold, or you can steal credentials with it. If you plug it in with Mimikatz, it will run Mimikatz real quick, copy the credentials back to the USB, unplug it, and that's it. You have the credentials stored on the USB drive. Another tool that we're going to see is PowerShell Empire, which actually Mimikatz benefits a lot if you manage to run it from PowerShell instead of on its standalone version or through the command. So a combination between PowerShell Empire, which actually has a module for Mimikatz already embedded in it, will benefit a lot, mutually benefit a lot from being able to get into a device, escalating privileges, and dumping a bunch of credentials and then navigating around into other devices in the network, pivoting, stuff like that. And then the Metasploit framework, similarly known for the exploitation and post-exploitation phase. In particular, Meterpreter will have also a module for Mimikatz already embedded in it. So as soon as you are exploiting or running through the post-exploitation steps, one of the things that you will be able to do is run Mimikatz and obtain credentials, authenticate, pass the hash, tickets, etc. So we'll see how that looks, starting off with the USB rubber ducky. I also wanted to add a couple of other devices. One of them is the DigiSpark AT Tiny, the one that you see on the right. It doesn't come with a case, unlike the rubber ducky, and it doesn't come with an SD card reader. You can probably attach one to it, but it's kind of wide to actually put it inside a case. Unlike the Wi-Fi duck, which also doesn't come with an SD card reader, but it does come with an ESP, so it has Wi-Fi. It's basically the same thing as the USB rubber ducky, but you can plug it in, leave it in there, and then control it remotely through Wi-Fi. Whichever the case may be, with all of them, you will be able to do an attack that basically you plug it in, you request Mimikatz from the internet, and I'll show that in a bit. You request Mimikatz either from another computer in the network, from Mimikatz website in GitHub, stuff like that. But only with a rubber ducky, because of the SD card, you will be able to make the SD card show as a USB mass storage device, and you will be able to run Mimikatz from there. Now, whichever route you choose, in both cases, you'll be able to run Mimikatz, obtain credentials, dump a bunch of stuff that you need for further attacks. So the top example, this is just a piece of a script. In the top example, you see that it's running PowerShell and that it's basically downloading the Mimikatz executable into the local computer. You can, like I said, you can do this either by just going to GitHub or just opening up an Apache server. Let's say you have Kali, you're within the network. You open up Apache server, you copy Mimikatz in it, and then you go with the rubber ducky to another computer, and you'll be able to load it. The cool thing about the rubber ducky, like I said, you can share the SD card, just put Mimikatz inside, and then you'll be able to take the rubber ducky, plug it in, it will automatically run Mimikatz, run what it needs in order to dump the credentials, save it to the USB, and you unplug it and keep walking. And that's going to happen super fast with the rubber ducky. Now, with PowerShell Empire, I wanted to start talking about pass the hash and overpass the hash. If you're using PowerShell Empire, which you might be using to, let's say for the initial social engineering attack, you're doing spear phishing, you grab a file, a Word document, you embed it with a PowerShell Empire, you send it, and once it opens, you need to start gaining a little bit of information about the device that you're in, other devices in the network, and then eventually move to those devices or try to obtain information from it. So in order to do this, you can use, of course, Mimikatz. So once PowerShell Empire is running, you can just type Mimikatz, or you can actually load different modules from it. Once you load them, you'll be able to just obtain the same, just like we saw at the beginning when you obtained the just the password hash. And then if you're in a situation where you have NTLM authentication, you'll be able to just pass the hash and do regular NTLM authentication. Or Mimikatz allows you to do something really cool that is called overpass the hash. And basically it allows you to get a full Kerberos ticket with just the password hash. In order to do that, you'll see the command that is in the picture. You see the command in order to obtain the hash. But on the top of the slide, you're gonna see the command that it requires a lot more than the other one. That just is like you're just specifying logon passwords to just dump the credentials. In this case, you're gonna add a bunch of different things like the username that you just found, the domain in which you're in, the NTLM hash that you just got with Mimikatz, and then an app to run. Again, you can run PowerShell ideally, and you'll leverage it a lot more than your regular command prompt. Once you do that, Mimikatz is going to create or basically prepare a ticket for you. But remember, the way that Kerberos works, you actually need to go to the domain controller and authenticate with it. So what you can do is just use whatever network resource, either shared storage or whatever you need in order to obtain something that will require authentication. And now that that information is there, thanks to Mimikatz, it will be able to authenticate with Kerberos, and it will be able to generate a ticket for it. So now let's talk about the next tool, which is the Metasploit framework. And let's talk about now with Kerberos with silver and golden tickets, which would basically be, if you're in a pen test engagement, this would probably be one of the coolest things to get, because it translates into a lot of access either to a bunch of servers with a silver ticket or to the domain controller as an admin with the golden ticket. So first, let's talk a little bit about the Metasploit framework. In a similar fashion than PowerShell Empire, it's going to have a tool that's going to have a bunch of different modules in it. You can leverage a lot of them and use a bunch of different elements included in them in order to pivot, move around, gather information, etc., etc. One thing to note, though, even though the Mimikatz is included within the Metasploit framework, you're going to see that it's called Kiwi. I would guess it has something to do with the fact that the username of the person who created Mimikatz is Gentle Kiwi. So whoever wrote the plugin for Interpreter probably was referencing that. Not entirely sure, though. But whatever the case may be, you just put load Kiwi. It will load your regular Mimikatz module, and then you'll be able to start using your old-fashioned Mimikatz commands in order to create either a golden or a silver ticket. Basically, if we go back to our talk about Kerberos, and we said that you first authenticate with the domain controller in order to obtain a ticket granting ticket. It's basically a ticket that allows you to get other tickets, the service tickets, which you in turn use in order to access different services or servers around the network. If you were to, by using Mimikatz, obtain any of the password hashes for either one of the servers, or better yet, for the domain controller, you can craft your own ticket granting ticket or your own service ticket. If you create your own service ticket that is to access one particular server, and you manage to obtain that password hash, now you'll be able to create a silver ticket using the password hash for that particular server. And with it, you can give you permissions in order to access everything on that particular service. When you create your own service ticket that allows you to access one particular server in whichever way you deem necessary, that's what's called a silver ticket, because it allows you to access only one device, but with as much access as you need. Now, the same thing, but happening with the domain controller. Now it's the domain controller password hash that you have obtained. Then you can use that to create your own ticket granting ticket, basically the ticket that allows you to get all the other tickets. That one is called a golden ticket. And one of the cool things it has, similar to the service ticket has basically, hey, what is this guy allowed to do within the server? In a similar fashion, your golden ticket is going to say, what groups does this user belong to? And since you created it, you can make yourself the domain admin. So by simply running Mimikatz, you can see on the lower screenshot to the right, the command golden ticket create is actually used to create both the silver and the golden ticket. It just depends, like I said, on which password hash you obtain. Is it just a service account, or is it a domain account? Depending on whether you are on the domain controller or one of the servers. You create that, you give yourself the appropriate permissions, or specify that you belong to the appropriate groups, and you'll have basically unlimited access to either one particular server with a silver ticket, or to the domain controller and to anything else that you need to with a golden ticket. Now, I didn't want to make this talk too long, so I will be doing another talk that will be a red team intro. And one of the things that we're going to talk about in it is how to use Mimikatz, but bypassing antivirus and different detection software. Because the tool is very well known, you can imagine that a lot of antivirus software is going to try to pick it up, try to stop it. And there's different techniques in order to try to bypass AV, since there's different techniques in order to actually run Mimikatz. You can run the executable alone. You can get a PowerShell script that will invoke it. So depending on which technique you're going to use, there will be different techniques in order to bypass the antivirus. If it's just a PowerShell script, you may just replace a couple of the keywords and you'll be able to run the PowerShell script. In other cases, you'll want to obfuscate the PowerShell script. So even the stuff that is readable before now won't be able to, whatever antivirus or endpoint security solution won't be able to read it, because you can actually encrypt it with AES. And of course, last but not least, actually encoding an executable and trying to run it in a way that doesn't use anything suspicious for the antivirus. Now, all of that is actually just too much content. So I'm gonna leave that for the red team intro, and I wanted to leave a little bit of time for questions, because I know that NTLM and Kerberos, it might raise some questions as to where or how you would actually use Mimikatz to obtain that information, move forward, stuff like that. If any of that wasn't clear enough, now will be an excellent moment for those questions.
All right. If you guys have questions for this, go ahead and ask them. You can unmute yourselves. Let me know if you have any issues.
Is there any type of cheat sheet that you'd recommend that you'd seen out there that we can go right ahead, take a look, and really start using it specifically with the rubber ducking?
Yeah, so let me go back real quick to, here it is. So the last line at the bottom is the source for all of the rubber ducky stuff. That's actually from the guy who made the rubber ducky. You can go over there and it actually explains in detail how both attacks would be performed. One of the cool things about the rubber ducky is that you can put it in, I believe they call it like twin duck mode, in which it can act as both a keyboard and USB mass storage. So you should be able to do all of the automation, all of the typing down, all of the putting the commands that you need in order to run Mimikatz, dump the credentials, copy them to a file, inside that basically second partition that is the shared SD card, and then just unplug the rubber ducky and you'll have all of the credentials in there.
Somebody had mentioned in the chat that there are payload generators online for both the rubber ducky and the DigiSpark. Last year I did a talk on how to make a, I think it was a $4 rubber ducky by using a DigiSpark board. So Dave and I had fun with that, and Dave is reminding everybody that there are those payload generators out there for both of them. And Dave is reminding us that the DigiSpark is a much cheaper version. Like I said, we did the talk on how to make a $4 rubber ducky with that DigiSpark.
Yeah, you can get like 5 for $10. So it would be like $2 each. And in my case, what I do is, because speaking of the rubber ducky and even the Wi-Fi duck, even though it's a bit cheaper, they're still too expensive to be like dropping around in an engagement. Let's say that you go to the client, go to the parking lot, and you want to drop about a bunch of these USB so somebody will pick it up and plug it in. That's probably not something that you'll want to do with a $50 rubber ducky, but you can buy a pack of 5 of these DigiSparks for $10. And then in my case, I used a 3D printer to just print that really cheap case because they're too wide to actually fit on the regular USB case. So I just ended up doing my own with a 3D printer, which is super cheap if you consider the price of a filament. And that was it, a cheap way of making a rubber ducky that I won't mind if I lose after the engagement.
I have one more question for you. You mentioned there's a Red Team event that you're going to be presenting. Are you also planning on doing a presentation from the Blue Team perspective, or is that something you've done in the past that I can look up somewhere?
I don't remember any Blue Team that demo specific to that, at least not that one that I've gone to. I do know that they recently did a couple of monitoring ones that would help, but at least I am not planning on covering this kind of stuff from a Blue Team perspective. I could do that. I don't think it should be. I think it would be a good idea to present both sides of it. We recently had an issue with a client, which is a client from another department. So we had like no idea of all of the cyber side. And recently we had to do a couple of incident response. And one of the things that we saw is a lot of people using PowerShell Empire and Mimikatz for their own attacks. A lot of hackers, even at a more advanced level, like saying full APT groups, just using PowerShell, Empire, Mimikatz, and a couple of things like that. So I think it will be a very good idea to do a talk about the blue side of that and how to respond, analyze, detect this kind of attacks.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions for this talk or the other? All right,
Okay.
Thank you very much, Henry. Really appreciate it. Lots of good information there. Assuming you'll give us the slides for that as well, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm gonna share them through Slack like the last time.
Okay, and then we've got the session recorded. So once that's finished processing, I'll give that to Rod and he can upload it wherever he's going to upload it, and they will post that in the event panel, I believe, is where they'll post the link to the presentation. And then, Rod, I wanted to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much for attending. Keep in touch with us at the Slack, the social media, and obviously this online meetups, and we'll continue updating depending on how things go. There is more to come today. In around 10 minutes, we'll have the meeting for OWASP Top 10 API at Pacific Hackers, which is the West Coast group of Percent 27. So join us in a little bit, and we'll continue learning and participating. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, guys. Have a great day. Have a great weekend.
You too. Bye. Thanks.
Ciao, ciao.